In the paper Abnormal Moral Context and the Case of Moral Responsibility for Implicit Bias, the author discusses implicit bias and the morale concerned with it. Implicit biases are caused by implicit attitudes that are subconscious and not directly controllable via force of will or mere intention, and explicit attitudes are deliberately formed conscious attitudes. The biases a person holds are formed by the person's attitude. In a social context, implicit biases often refer to a disproportionate favor or dislike for a thing, person, or group in comparison to other things, persons, or group. They allegedly bias our behavior in stereotypical and prejudiced ways.
If a person's actions are caused by implicit biases, the question arises whether the person is morally responsible for those particular actions. Even if we are not morally responsible for actions caused by implicit biases, we should still try to respond critically to these actions. This is because the harm done may constitute a structural problem, and because such critical responses may end systematic discriminatory aspects of everyday life caused by implicit bias. Next, we will approach the mechanisms and the impact of implicit bias, ending with discussing implicit bias in an abnormal context. The mechanisms of implicit bias are often referred to as automatic associations, which affect how we interact with stereotyped attitude objects. However, even though these processes are deemed automatic, the literature does not necessarily say we are never morally responsible for implicit biases. And in the case of human agents, self-control goes beyond the control we exert at the moment of our actions, which means to a certain extent, people are able to shape their beliefs, attitudes, and views of the world. Therefore, even if we are not morally responsible, it is argued that in some cases we should still address the harm done. When it comes to the impact of implicit bias, we can distinguish between general harm and localized harm. General harm refers to the microaggressions and micro-inequities, which allegedly cause people who belong to different social groups to be interacted with differently. Microaggressions are minor remarks, gestures, and responses that are derogatory in some way. Micro-inequities are seemingly innocent ways in which people are treated differently on the basis of the social category they belong to. Microaggressions and micro-inequities might contribute together to the stereotype threat, which is stereotypes that negatively influence people's performance psychologically. For example, women being bad at math being the result of the stereotype rather than an actual lack of mathematical abilities. Another form of impact is unequal offering of resources that help people understand themselves, called hermeneutical injustice, and appointing status to people based on their knowledge contributions, called testimonial injustice, that together form epistemic injustice, or the unequal distribution of power in society. With localized harms, it is clear that we should do all we can to correct for the harm done, and it's also clear what our egalitarian commitments entail. What distinguishes localized harms from more general ones, beside the fact that they are easier to pinpoint and address, is that it's not controversial or difficult to understand what our egalitarian commitments entails in the localized cases.
There are two approaches for determining whether people should be held accountable for their active behavior according to the implicit biases that they inherit. You either focus on the harm done, or you focus on the question whether we are morally responsible for actions caused by implicit bias. Harm done by implicit bias might be problematic, thus critical responses are needed to make our practices more egalitarian. In the end, what we can consider reasonable regarding expectations from another concerning our implicit biases depends on how we evaluate the harm it inflicts.
There are questions about whether it is possible to counteract general harm done by implicit biases, and whether implicit biases even exist, and what they are exactly, and whether we have found ways to measure them. The paper is built on the premise that there is evidence for implicit bias, and that implicit bias can be rigorously and meaningfully tested, and even measured. However, there are some concerns about the design of the test regarding its validity and reliability. Take the current most widely used test for implicit bias, the implicit association test. There are several issues regarding the validity, reliability, and replicability of the test. The IAT shows inconsistent test-retest reliability, meaning that taking the test multiple times can often lead to different results. There is very little evidence that the implicit bias that the test supposedly measures manifests itself in measurable behavior. One other issue is that it is difficult to differentiate between implicit bias and familiarity preference or novelty aversion. That is, having an aversion towards anything new, which is not exclusive to an aversion towards an outgroup. You would have to find a person in a racial group who is just as familiar with other racial groups as his own group, because otherwise you are unable to distinguish bias from novelty aversion. However, this may not necessarily have any consequences for our moral responsibility.
So, what have we learned from this paper? Well, what's at least relevant and interesting about this paper, considering diversity, is that it strikes one of the common problems which we encounter in highly diverse areas, namely negative presumptions people hold about individuals who belong to other ethnicities and social groups. Many of these acts of implicit bias mentioned in the paper are based upon perceptions on individuals from other minorities. For instance, with the shooter's bias example, which shows that random objects which are held by black people are earlier perceived as guns, opposed to when they are held by white people. Or the phenomenon of one firmly clutching one's purse when they interact with someone from another ethnicity, which they implicitly perceive as potential thieves. If diverse societies would succeed in tackling these cases of implicit bias, this could create more tolerant, diverse societies. What we have mainly learned from this paper is that the earlier mentioned negative presumptions held towards other ethnicities are in many cases not held consciously. Since the concept of implicit bias entails that these perceptions could be deeply rooted in an individual's way of thinking without the individual being aware of this, and this makes it hard to label certain actions as morally good or bad, or making the question how to deal with these acts even harder. However, as said in the paper, raising awareness about the existence of implicit biases may already be a part of the solution. When people realize they have acted or are acting according to these notions of implicit bias, even though they have always perceived themselves as tolerant and accepting individuals, it would stimulate them to alter their behavior. So what we've mainly learned is that we are all prone to implicit bias and that we should keep this in mind.